So we are going into a new style of Bible study today, where over the next couple of months, I'm going to request each one of you to take a study. So today, John Jacob is going to take the study, and what we're going to do is have a 30-minute study, 30 minutes or more, and then we can have a discussion around that topic. So you have the freedom to choose any topic. And this month, I've already asked four of our brothers, and then I'll be asking the rest of you to take the studies, right? So over to you, Jerry.
Thank you, Uncle. Praise be to God. I thankful to God for this opportunity. And I was thinking about what we can study as a group of young believers, young men. And I was led to the book of Judges, actually. And I wanted to do a study on the book of Judges, but it's a wide number of judges to cover in 30 minutes. So thought we look at the life of one judge that kind of captures the whole sense of the times during that time. And we see that we see at the start of the book of Judges, we see the promised land was predominantly captured by Israel, but there was still some work to be done. So we read starting from chapter 1, a few verses, and as we go along, we'll try to see what the calling of the people of God was, what their calling was. Secondly, we'll try to see what they were entrusted to do, or what their fight was, or who their fight was against. And thirdly, we'll see what progress they made and or what they achieved at the end of it. So just keep these three things in mind as we go through the book of Judges and the life of one judge. So coming to, I'll just share my screen. I think if it's easier. Okay, I'm unable to share my screen. Okay. Um,
I made you co-host. You should be able to share.
yeah, I think it's because of my machine. Uh, yeah, let me try again. Okay, I'm not able to share. I think I'll join again quickly. Uh, Changing the settings. Sorry.
In the meantime, let's welcome Nathan. Glad to have you with us.
Should I say something?
Yes, please.
Thank you for welcoming me.
Jerry, we can't hear you. Nice to see Manas as well. He's in Kolkata, right, Uncle?
Yep, that's right.
Yeah. Hi, Manas. How are you?
Okay, I hope, yeah, and I think now I can share my screen. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Sorry, some of my settings in my office laptop, so sometimes it. Yeah, coming to chapter 1 of Judges, um, we see that they were the calling of the Lord's people was to be separated unto the Lord, uh, and their fight was against the Canaanites and the Ammonites, the Midianites, the Moabites. And the book of Judges outlines their fights against these people. And periodically, it's a vicious cycle of how the people sinned against God and went again seeking foreign gods, and then God would they would cry out in their distress. God would hear and raise a judge to save his people from the people uh, around them, and that was the vicious cycle. And 12 judges and a lot of cycles of this happening over and over again. It all started with the calling of God, and then we see their fight. In their fight, they failed to complete the conquest. So in chapter 1, if we read verse 27 onwards, we see Manasseh did not drive out the people of Bethshan. In 28, we read, when Israel became strong, they pressed the Canaanites into forced labor, but never drove them out completely. Ephraim, nor did Ephraim drive out the Canaanites, and so on. We see that they failed to complete the conquest, the calling, the fight that they had to fight, and they didn't complete it. And in chapter 2 onwards, we see their failure to live according to the covenant that they had agreed to with the Lord, the covenant that entered to with the Lord. They failed to uh, honor the covenant, and that's what we read in chapter 2. And then whenever Israel went to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, we read, and they were in great distress. And then the Lord raised up judges, and that's what we see. So their calling, they knew their fight, they didn't finish, and their progress throughout the book of Judges, we read in the last chapter of Judges that everyone did as they wished in the sight in his own eyes. And that was the spiritual legacy, spiritual bankruptcy at the end of the book of Judges that we see. So that brings us to, I thought we'll go through the life of Samson and see what we can learn from his life with the same framework: his calling, his fights, his walk, and the progress that he made, or his legacy at the end of his life. Um, so coming to the life of Samson, we know about Samson, we know what he did, but just to go over uh, the initial portion of his life, we'll read from chapter 13 and verse 5. So this is the angel of the Lord talking to his mother and says, "You'll become pregnant and have a son, whose head is never to be touched by a razor, because the boy is to be a Nazirite, dedicated to God from the womb, and he'll take the lead in delivering Israel from the hands of the Philistines." So all the other judges have passed, and now the Philistines are left to be eliminated or to be conquered, and they are basically a thorn in the flesh of the Israelites. And God God has a great mission when Samson comes to the scene. Before he is born, his birth is announced by angels, and we see he's born to barren parents. His mother was barren, and his father Manoah, he saw the Lord's will in the life of his son. We see that in verse 13, and in verse 12. So Manoah asked him, what is to be the rule that governs the boy's life and work? So we see godly parents, we see a good spiritual heritage governing the initial portion of his life, and we see the mission that governed Samson's calling. We see that God had a specific mission for Samson, and he was supposed to be separate from the world and consecrated for the Lord's service. We read about this in verse 7. We see that um, the boy will be a Nazarite of God from the womb until the day of his death. So this term Nazarite is not to be confused with Nazarene, which Jesus was. He was from the town of Nazareth. This term Nazarite is basically something that denotes consecration or separation unto God, for someone who separated unto God for his service. And there was a vow that anyone who wanted to take this vow could take it from the land of Israel, and they had to take it for a specific period of time, and they would make vows that they would probably keep till that duration ends. But for Samson, what was different was he was supposed to be a Nazarite until the day of his death, which means there was no timestamp on the time period to which he would have to obey those rules. And what were those rules? We see in the book of Numbers, we see the vows that they had to take. So one was not to cut their hair. The second was not to go to have any contact with any dead thing, which would be unclean. And third was not to have any alcohol. So we see uh, a clear separation of Samson for the service of the Lord. And there was a real clear calling for Samson in his life. And uh, looking at our lives, like what can we learn? We are all set apart. We know that we are saved and we are all called to live a life set apart for God. And God has called us to a higher purpose. So the question we need to ask ourselves is, have we understood the purpose of God through our lives? Do we know our calling? I think you can read Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 15 to 17. It reads like this: Be very careful then how you live, not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity, because the days are evil. Not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity, because the days are evil. Be not foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. So I think as believers, all of us are called to a purpose, and our calling is broadly the same, but specifically it may be different, as was in the case of Samson. His specific mission was to go against the Philistines and to win against the Philistines. Our calling may be different, but unless we know our calling, unless we know that the purpose of our being, or unless we live out the mission that we are assigned to as believers, we will not be able to fight the battles that we have to fight. Which is why the calling, identifying our calling and identifying and recognizing our mission is important. So that's the calling. Now let's just go quickly into the life of Samson. Uh, yeah, we'll just quickly go through the life of Samson to see how his life looked. What were his ups and downs? How does the chart of his life look like? Um, so that's basically, we know that he had a strong calling, and we see in chapter 13, the last few verses, that he grew in the Lord, and the Lord blessed him, and the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him. So that's a great start, right? A great spiritual heritage, and most of us are blessed with that. We come from godly homes. I remember Jerry Uncle took a message on starting well and finishing well. So most of us have been blessed with good starts, and we in the next chapter we see, how Samson's life progressed, and in chapter 14 we see Samson's marriage. So he's now of marriageable age, and he goes to Timnah, a place called Timnah, and he sees a Philistine woman. And when he returned, he tells his father and mother, I've seen a Philistine woman in Timnah. Get her for me as my wife. So I just want to highlight this verse. If we have underliners, we can underline it. I have seen a Philistine woman in Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife. It tells us two things. I have seen. So he's a man who is driven by sight, and he says, and wants. Basically, he's saying, I've seen, I want. I have seen, I want it. And his father and mother in godly wisdom replies to him saying, isn't there anyone else from our people? But Samson says, get her for me. She's the right one for me. So he's guided by his convictions, which are based on his sight. Then we come to verse 6. He's on the way to see Timnah. I mean, to see the woman in Timnah, and the Spirit of the Lord comes powerfully upon him. Right, he's going to have an alliance with an ungodly woman, which is obviously not pleasing in the sight of the Lord. But the Lord is trying to show him what he can achieve through his life. The Spirit of the Lord comes powerfully upon him, and he tore a line as if it was a young kid, a young goat. And he didn't tell his parents what he had done, but then they went to see this woman, and he liked her. So the if we stop here for a minute, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him. The Lord worked through him and used his gift, which was his strength, to show him what the Lord could achieve in his life. And that didn't stop him from taking the next few steps to go towards this woman, take his next steps to probably dishonor God. Uh, and when we see in verse 8, he comes back after some time to marry her. On his way to marry her, he sees this lion. He sees the lion that he killed as a reminder of the work of God in his life. But what does he do here? He sees the honey, the bees and the honey in the carcass of the lion. Now, if you remember, the one of the vows is not to defile himself with anything dead. And he goes to this carcass and he takes the honey out of it and he tastes it. He ate it, and he also gives it to his parents. And so we see a compromise here, right? A break of one of the vows that he had taken. And then in verse 10 we see that he goes to the Philistines and he throws a party. And that word party essentially is, it's like a bachelor party, because he's getting married, and he's happy and he's throwing a feast. And the Hebrew word also indicates that it was a it was a it was a party with alcohol. So he was, the second vow was he was not to have any alcohol, right? It doesn't explicitly say that he broke that vow, but at least he endorsed it by having a party with um, alcohol. And in verse 11, we see his friendships. When we come to verse 11, we see the people saw him. They chose 30 men to be his companions. He didn't have any friends. He didn't have any friends, and people felt bad probably, and they bought 30 men to be his friends. And soon enough, he gets very comfortable with them. And then in verse 12, he makes a bet. One thing leads to another, and it leads to a bet. And he if you see the riddle, it was exactly the sin that he did by touching the honey from the carcass of the lion. And he made that into a joke or a riddle. And one thing leads to another, and in the following verses we see how his life spirals out of control, right? We see they couldn't answer the riddle, so they threatens his wife, and then she reveals the answer when Samson reveals it to her. And then he goes on this rampage, right? He goes on this revenge mode to kill the Philistines, to destroy them. But uh, another thing to note here is that every act of strength that he did, be it the 30 people that he killed, to get the cloaks for the to pay the bet, or the 1,000 people that he killed to with the jawbone of a donkey, at every stage the Lord was still empowering him to do those things. It was not of his own strength. We read in those verses that the Lord strengthened him, and his major victories were still because of God, and that should have drawn him closer to God. Even though at every stage he was failing and faltering, God was still working through him and showing him that he was called for another purpose. But that didn't stop him. And in chapter 15 is where we see all the victories that he had over the Philistines. And then in chapter 16, verse 1, this was after, let's also read 15, verse 28 first. Sorry. Yeah, 15, verse 18. You have given your servant great victory. He's telling the Lord that you've given me great victory. Um, and that itself should have prompted him to mend his ways when he saw that he was going away from God. He should have mended his ways right there. But then we see in chapter 16 and verse 1, his the second woman. Uh, One day, Samson went to Gaza. There, he saw a prostitute. He went in to spend the night with her. Again, we see he saw. Uh, it's becoming a habit now. Um, Despite God's working, despite God's warnings, probably, or he didn't heed it, and we see his second sin. And a few verses later, we see the third woman, Delilah, who proved to be his undoing, who proved to be his final, um, uh, the person who brought him down. So that's basically the life of Samson that we went through, and just want to discuss a few patterns or problems that we observe. If, open to everyone, like, what do you think was what do you think was wrong with Samson? He had a very clear vision. If he was probably accompany his mission, his vision, his everything was listed and given to him, and all he had to do was use God's strength to overcome the Philistines. So, what do you think went wrong with him? Uh,
He fell prey to the lust of his eyes.
right. He was a man given to his desires. Okay. Okay, let's take that first. So, if I were to put it in a different way, he was the perfect example of the life of the times, right? In the last verse of Judges, we read that every man did what was right in his eyes. So did Samson. He was the poster boy for, life in uh, that year, or that he would have been on the poster of Time magazine probably. And he was driven by his lust. So we see twice he saw a woman in Timnah. He saw a harlot in Gaza. He saw Delilah in the valley. So he was incredibly strong from a physical standpoint, uh, but from inside, we see him dangerously weak. He had a dangerously weak will. So he was driven by desire, and his will was not aligned to God's will. Um, Anything else in his character? He lacked self-control, right? He also got angry a couple of times. He had no grip over uh, himself. There was no self-control. Uh, so, in short, we can say this pattern existed in life, that he had a calling. He was incredibly strong, and he even saw God's power working in him and through him. But he was dangerously weak in his will, and he lacked submission of his will to God's will for him, or he wasn't separated to God's call for him or aligned to God's will for him. And once we realize our calling, our mission, we also have the same fight, right? We have an enemy to fight, and sometimes we lose sight of the enemy. After his marriage failed, he should have realized, see, this is my weakness. This is my Achilles heel. The lust of my eyes is causing me to fall and fall short of God's plans for me, um, achieving God's plans for me, but he didn't. And when we look at our lives, do we have these moments of victories, and then soon after we have so many embarrassing failures? And does it become a habit because of our dangerously weak will? Um, so, questions that we can ask ourselves probably are: what is the primary criteria when we make certain important decisions in our life? Maybe may even be a small decision in our life. What is driving us to do certain things? Is it something that pleases us, or something that pleases God? Samson's motto was definitely something that pleased him. That was more important to him. We will read one verse. Um, 2 Corinthians 10, verse 4 and 5. Yeah. reads like this: We have divine power to demolish strongholds. Sorry, the weapons we fight with are not weapons of the world. On the contrary, we have divine power to demolish strongholds. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take every thought and make it obedient to Christ. And so, to fulfill God's calling, basically, we have to decide if we are going to be driven by God's will for us or the desire of our will. What the writer says here is we take every thought and make it obedient to Christ. In the Proverbs, we also read a person without self-control, right, is like a city with broken down walls. It leaves you defenseless against the enemy. That was the state of Samson, right? And we see in the times of Nehemiah as well, we see the walls are broken and the people around are basically persecuting them, and the influences of the world is creeping in because of that the lack of walls. So, do we have a burden for the walls of our hearts to respect the boundaries that God has intended for us? If not, Satan will rule our lives, and we will not be a vessel that accomplishes God's mission, but we will be a hindrance to God, to bring glory and honor to God. Another important thing here is that despite Samson's failures, God was still using him, and it's not justification to the fact that we should continue in our trajectory or our journey, and God will use us. What could have been of Samson was far greater than what he achieved for God, and so uh, we need to have the Lord rule us and our wills and submit to Him rather than having a dangerously weak will. The second thing we see in the life of Samson is that he had a very casual attitude to sin, right? When we come back to Judges chapter 16, we read his what he did with Delilah. He had a very casual. We already saw how he broke the vows. The last one is still yet to be broken. The hair, he'll not shave off his head. But he he's now playing with fire. He's already compromised a lot many times, and now he's at this point where um, he's with Delilah. Let's read verse 7. And Delilah is basically trying to get the secret of his strength out of him. And Samson knows, right? So Samson knows the cost. He knows that if he is to tell her the secret, he's going to lose his strength. But and so he tries to guard his secret, and he lies to her 3 times. We see in verse 7, if anyone ties me with 7 fresh bowstrings that have not been tried, I'll become as weak as any other man. So the first lie, he tries to play with. This has become a cheap thrill for him. He's trying to play with fire and see how far he can go before he stops. In verse 11, he says, if anyone ties me securely with new ropes that have never been used, I'll become weak as any other man. And obviously, he was able to snap out of those ropes. See, God is still with him. Even though he's so patient, he's so merciful to Samson. Then again in verse 13, um, yeah, he says, if you weave the 7 braids of my head into the fabric on the loom and tighten it with the pin, I'll become as weak as any other man. If you notice in this explanation that he gives, or reason that he gives behind the strength, he says he's getting closer to the hair, right? He's pushing, he's actually playing with how far he can go. And it had become a game, a thrill for him, and he's entertained by the pleasure that he's getting out of it. And if Delilah was smarter, maybe she would have gotten it then, but she didn't. Uh, and but yeah, that didn't stop her. She vexes him. The word in the KJV is that she vexed him into submission. At this point, he is so impaired with his sin that he's come to a crossroads, right? And Delilah uses that opportunity to manipulate his love for her. So she says, how can you say that you love me when you don't confide in me? At this point, Samson knows that he has to make a choice between giving out a secret and continuing with Delilah. And that was and Samson knew the cost, right? But he compromised again. Uh, he knew that it would cost him his strength, but he wanted to yet continue in his sin with Delilah. And so he tells her the secret. And then we know what happened, right? Uh, the whole point of, I mean, we don't have time to read through the rest of what happened. What happened was he lost the enabling of the Lord. It's one of the saddest verses in this chapter. He didn't realize that the Lord had left him. Sin has consequences. He thought he was in control over the situation. He thought, okay, I can snap out of it, just like every other time. Uh, Sometimes when we play with sin, we take the power of it wearing us down, wearing our walls down so for granted that eventually we fall, and it we don't even know that it happened. It's only when we face the consequences of the sin that we know that we have fallen, and that is what we have to guard against and not play with sin, and that's exactly what Samson did. So he lost the enabling of the Lord. He lost his vision. The Philistines plucked out his eyes. Uh, he had already lost his spiritual vision, right? He had already lost that side of the story. But now he's lost his physical vision. That was the very source of his pleasure. He gained everything in life for him was his vision, right? His pleasure in life was his vision so far. And now he's lost that. That was the tragedy. He thought he could get away with sin and escape the consequences, and he misinterpreted God's delay in judgment or God's abundant mercies. He was very presumptuous in believing that it would continue. But at this point, his hair was shorn, and the last sign of his consecration to God was also gone, and God had left him. We'll read 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 21. Verse 20 and 21. In a large house, there are articles not only of gold and silver, but also wood and clay. Some are for special purposes and some for common use. Those who cleanse themselves from the latter will be instruments for special purposes, made holy, useful to the master, and prepared to do any good work. This is written in the context of false teachers, but it's also applicable here. Basically, he's telling Timothy, you need to be a vessel for good use, and if you need to be a vessel for God's use, you need to flee youthful passions. You need to cleanse yourself and be made holy. And yeah, I was just looking for another aspect in that verse. Flee youthful passions. There's a verse that says, flee youthful passions and along with those who call upon the Lord with a pure heart. Oh yeah, it's here. Um, yeah, flee evil desires of your youth, pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace, along with those who call on the Lord with a pure heart. Um, Basically, it's telling us what our friendship should be like, right? Or our company should be like with those who call upon the Lord with a pure heart. Not only should we pursue these things, we should pursue it with people who call out to the Lord with a pure heart. Samson, if you look at his life, we already saw that he had no friends. His friends were the Philistines, who the Philistines bought for him. Um, he was basically a loner, right? He didn't surround himself with people. He even kept secrets from his parents. If you read closely, he didn't tell what he did to his parents. At times, he hid certain things from his parents. And he was essentially somebody who tried to manage his own show or manage his own life on his own. And often, when we live like that, when we reject godly advice, like Samson, when we don't surround ourselves with godly people, spiritual mentors, and accountability partners, uh, those are the times when especially when we are struggling with these things, those are the times that Satan really destroys us, because we are fighting alone and we are not even trusting God to help us, like Samson. So Samson knew his calling. He lost his battles that he was facing internally. His external battles he won uh, by God's grace, despite his internal failures. So his calling, his fights, and lastly his progress. Right? We see at the end of his life total a very sorry state. He's brought into the temple of this false god Dagon, and he's a slave to the Philistines. He's grinding, which is a very menial job to do, and he is being made fun of by the people. Uh, a very sad and sorry state of affairs. Just wanted to, we don't have time, but just wanted to quickly go through the life of Josiah. We read of King Josiah in chapter 34 of Second Chronicles. Uh, he lived in a period of time which was very dark, one of the darkest times in the history of Israel. Before him and after David, there were only two kings in Judah that did right in the sight of the Lord. One was his uh, great grandfather, and the other was him. So his father was evil. His grandfather Manasseh was one of the most evil kings in Israel. He did basically he did everything that was abominable to the Lord. I think he ticked all the boxes for an evil person. And it's in that background that Josiah is coming to the scene, and it's a it's God's grace that he sought the Lord. It's not mentioned how he knew the Lord, but we see that he had no potential. If you were to put money on this king being a follower of God, you wouldn't. Like everything was against him. He had no potential, no spiritual heritage. He was essentially set up to fail. But we see in his life, he seeks God at a young age. In the 8th year of his reign, when he was still young, he began to seek God of his father David, and then we see the progress. So we were talking about, what is the progress that we see, how maybe we are failing some of our battles, but are we still seeing a progress in our life? uh, Samson, we saw a decline, and in the life of Josiah, however, we see a steady progress. In the 12th year, he began to purge Judah and Jerusalem of the idols and the high places. Mostly in the 50 years of his grandfather's reign, he had built up all these places. He didn't look at these places as, his grandfather's heritage. He sought the Lord, and he tried to remove all these idols and remove all the idol worship from the land in the 12th year. And then slowly his convictions and his direction, uh, I mean, his sense of service to the Lord was strengthened. And then in the 18th year of his reign, I think we read it in Second Kings 22. We also read it here. In the 18th year of his reign, he started purifying the land and the temple. He basically begins to collect funds to rebuild the temple. So we see 8th year, 12th year, 18th year, a steady progress and no signs of faltering um, in Josiah's life. The question to ask ourselves is, what is our progress? And uh, if we have to look back at our victories and see that, it was some time ago, like when Samson goes back to that lion's carcass, it was a prior victory in his life. And that should have told him that, he's not doing something right, because he didn't see any victories after that. So when was the last victory? What is the progress that we've made in our mission for God, in our fight against the evil one? If we don't see an upward spiral, then we need to at least arrest the downward spiral in our lives. So that just in the last 5 minutes, I just want to discuss, what we can do uh, to. We are all weak as men, as humans. We are not promised a life without temptation and the lust that we face. But what can we do to be made strong? How can weak men be made strong? Uh, I've listed, like, maybe we can discuss it. We it's not a one size fits all solution for everyone, but we just look at the word of God and see few things we can do, and maybe we can then open it up for other questions. Uh, I think the first thing we need to do is recognize our weakness, right? Samson had a blind spot. It was that he never recognized his weakness, despite his glaring errors. He never stopped to think, why am I like this, or what is causing me to fall? And he turned a blind eye to his weaknesses. And in doing this, when we turn a blind eye to our faults, or failures, or something that is causing us to fail or fall, what we do is we deceive ourselves. We don't deceive others only, but we deceive ourselves as well. Oftentimes we try to cover it up to deceive others, but slowly we start deceiving ourselves as well. Samson, outwardly, he still looked like a Nazarite when he had the hair, right? But and maybe everyone thought he's still uh, right with the Lord, but he had drifted, right? He had drifted away from God. And uh, point is that we need to assess our weaknesses. We need to pinpoint our weaknesses in our lives, because unless a person was never thought about the deliberate choices that he will be forced to face by the evil one, will always struggle. If a person doesn't know his weaknesses, he'll fail to guard it, right? And for that very reason, preparation is essential, so that when we are prepared to make a choice, we are we can be prepared to do the harder thing and obey. So our weakness, our will versus God's will. Maybe we can write it down. Maybe we can think about it. What is the weakness that's driving us to sin? What is our will in that whole process, and what is God's will for us? We read First Corinthians 9 and verse 27. Um, don't think I have it here. Yeah. So it says, I discipline my body like an athlete, training it to do what it should do. Otherwise, I fear that after preaching to others, I myself might be disqualified. Uh, Two things: discipline and training. He's essentially saying, I know what my body wants to do, but I will decide what it should do, and I will uh, train it in the ways in what it should do, um, to keep it in subjection. Right? This is something that Samson didn't do. When we read Job chapter 31 and verse 1, we read Job makes a covenant. He says, I made a covenant with my eyes not to look with lust at a young woman. It's basically something that he purposed in his heart, just like Daniel, to not do, so that he would honor God. So spotting our blind spots, spotting our weaknesses, and training our hearts not to do it will definitely help. And secondly, uh, Samson didn't treat sin seriously, right? We saw how he kept compromising, how he kept flirting with danger, and he was bound again and again, and he snapped out of it, being strong enough. He thought he's in total control, but the word of God says, I think Matthew chapter 5, I think we read, if your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away, because it's better that you lose one of your members than your whole body be thrown into the lake of fire. So we should have hard stops. We need to find those things. Once we've identified those things, cut it off. Have those hard stops. Don't go to the places that make us weak, right? Like Samson goes to Timnah, Samson goes to Gaza. Don't go to the places that make us weak, and realize that our sin has consequences. And lastly, we need to realize that we need God. I think very often in our fight, we leave God out of it because we are too ashamed to tell God our failures and ask for strength. Uh, when we read Ephesians, we read in chapter 1 the many spiritual blessings that we are blessed with. And when we come to chapter 6, we read, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. We can't stand against the current of life on our own, right? How do we survive? And then he goes on to say, putting on the whole armor of God. I don't know if I have it here, but yeah, overall, he says, put on the whole armor of God. We need to put on God and his might. I just want to read a few verses that will help us understand that better. First Corinthians 3 and verse 18. Sorry, Second Corinthians. Yeah, something that will help us resist the devil. Um, I think there's an author called John Piper. He has this blog called Desiring God. I don't know if you've read it, but something that he says is something that he said about resisting the devil and resisting lust just really stood out. So I just quickly mention it. He said it in the context of bodybuilding. So I don't know how many of us go to the gym, but we know the concept, right? There are two aspects to it. There's the resistance aspect. You know, when we put our muscles under the resistance of weight, you are resisting and resisting it, and at the end of it, you're all exhausted and your muscles are tired, but you didn't let it break you. You didn't let the weight fall upon you. You didn't let it hurt you, and somehow by that process, along with resistance, you also nourish your body after that, right? You strengthen your body with the nourishment that comes from food, proteins, whatever it is. Similarly, when we resist the devil, we build we and not let it hurt us. Somehow we build resistance to the things of the things that the devil hurts us or tries to hurt us with. And secondly, the whole point of him bringing that resistance was to the second portion of what he says is we need to be receptive. We need to nourish our bodies as well. And what do we nourish our bodies with? We nourish it with the word of God. We nourish it with the the strength of the spirit. When we fix our gaze on the Lord, when we hear this verse says exactly that, who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory, we are being transformed into his image with increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. It comes from the Lord, right? And when we look at the Lord and we fill our hearts, when we fix our hearts and gaze upon the Lord, when we linger over the descriptions of the work of God and the person of the Lord, and when we absorb and receive the knowledge of God, that really will transform our mind. That's what this word verse says. The more we read, the more we meditate, the more we will have the desires and convictions and the preferences of the Lord ruling our hearts. And that's how we will be transformed. Just like Josiah, in his initial years, we read that he sought the Lord. And when we seek the Lord, when we fill our minds, our hearts with the things of the Lord, and we nourish our inner man with those things, that will transform us. Um, yeah, there's another verse, Colossians 3, verse 10. I'll just pull it up. We have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge in the image of its creator. It says that we have to put on the new self. Uh, the transformation of the mind, we read, happens with knowledge. The more we put on Jesus, the more we put on the Lord Jesus Christ, the more we will be transformed and renewed. And that has to do with, putting on in the sense that we align our will with God's will in our lives, and that's how we will be able to flee the wiles of the evil one. And there are other verses, but due to lack of time, we'll stop here. And just want to close with uh, those 3 points again. Have we identified our calling? If not, we need to uh, have that mission so that we're not set up to fail. We're not set up to have a spiritual bankruptcy at the end of our walk. How is our fight? Are we guarding our hearts? And what is our progress in achieving our calling? I think the Lord will help us as we gaze on Him to strengthen us, to strengthen our inner man, to achieve what God has in store for us, and not be like Samson, who had a very shallow legacy to leave. Although he's mentioned in the Hall of Faith in Hebrews chapter 11, that was on account of one of the things that he did in his life. And that that isn't justification for all the other things that he could have done. So if you read further, the Philistines continued to be a thorn in the flesh of the Israelites until the reign of David. And so he didn't finish his charter, he didn't finish his mission. Yeah, so hope this will help us to actively uh, fight our fight and manage our progress in the things of the Lord. Maybe we'll have some other questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jerry. One of the questions I had from one of the verses that he pointed out, 2 Corinthians 10, verse 4 and 5, the weapons that we have, they have divine power to overthrow what?
Oh,
Let's look at that. Yeah.
yeah.
So my question was, basically they're going to help us to in our 2 Corinthians 10, 4 and 5. To destroy strongholds, and we destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive. Obviously, he's talking about false doctrine. That's number one. But what are these weapons really? It's not a very complicated answer, but it's good for us to identify what are the weapons that God has given us from the Word of God. The weapons that have divine power.
The armor of God is given in Ephesians. So the word of God, the faith that we have as well.
Yes, the Word of God, faith, a life of righteousness, the gospel, these are the things that you can use. That means, so to be practical, how do you use that? Weapons that have divine power.
I think the armor of God captures it in the entirety. And some of feet short with the gospel, you might wonder how that has to do with anything about fighting, but it is actually leading you to your purpose and of spreading the gospel, and that keeps you close to the Lord, and that keeps you busy, and you don't get sidetracked. And you have the belt of truth.
Yes.
So
again, what's the belt of truth? It is knowing and understanding the truth and living a life of truth, not living a life of deception. So that is, so, when you look at each of those aspects, there is a doctrinal aspect and there is a practical aspect also. The Word of God is the doctrinal aspect, knowing the truth, understanding the truth, applying the truth. The belt of truth, again, doctrine, but living a life of truth, righteousness. On the one hand, accepting that I can never be righteous before God, and God gives me his righteousness. On the other hand, I strive to live a life of righteousness, so that nobody can point a finger at me. Nobody can say that this is something wrong with you, this is not right, etc., etc. So, knowing the word and living out the word. So, number one is certainly, the those spiritual weapons in the armor of God. Is there anything else? Divine weapons, weapons that have divine power.
Prayer.
Okay, and how does that help us? Speaking practically, I don't know if there's any one of us who has developed the habit of prayer, or praying long prayers, praying for a long time. But being in an attitude of prayer is so critical. To raise up, I always like Nehemiah's example. In the midst of the battle, he would raise a cry of prayer. He would raise a sentence of prayer right in the middle and say, "Oh God, help me. Oh God, show your power here." And that is so critical. What else? A very important aspect is God's people, fellowship. In the sense, mingling with God's people. There's a danger here, and I know I mentioned it. Sometimes you can have too much of God's people. What does that mean? That means we'll never be in the world. We'll never hang out with anybody else. And, we tend to be so focused on only believers. And that's also wrong, right? But when it counts, you should have godly men around you, as Jerry already very, very rightly pointed out. Surround yourself with great men who will mentor you, disciple you, pray with you, even peers, and also pour your life into somebody else, right? And have those kind of people around you who can guard you and guide you into the truth. Absolutely important. Okay. The other thing I liked about the study was about finding your purpose, understanding your purpose. It was so clear, isn't it? Samson had a very, very clear purpose in his life. Right from birth, it was designed. And that's only a picture for each one of us. Actually, for every one of us, that purpose is predetermined. You just have to find it. You just have to find it. What is the God's plan for you? And it is fixed in the gifts that God gives you, the talents, the abilities, the family God placed you in, the education that God is giving you. All these are factors that will help you to define what is your purpose in life. What is it that God intends to do through you in this world? None of what you are and what you have is a mistake. But remember, it is not for you, it is for God. Samson misunderstood that. One interesting thing about Samson, I don't know if you read, we all see pictures of Samson as a big burly man with big thick muscles. Does the Bible ever say anything about that? There is nothing. There's no description of Samson's physique. It was clearly supernatural. Clearly, the strength was supernatural. Right? And that's why people were amazed. What is the secret of his strength? If it was his muscle, right, it would have been very obvious, isn't it? Obviously, it's my muscle. If I can pull the gate and carry it all the way and plant it on the mountain, if I can kill 10,000 Philistines, if I can, kill the lion, it was not his muscles at all. It had nothing to do with his physique. It was supernatural. And that's what people should say about you and me. That such an ordinary person can do so much, such an ordinary person can serve the Lord so much, can be so mightily used. That's amazing. That's an amazing testimony.
Uncle, I had a question regarding his mention in the Hall of Fame. So, is it only on account of his last call to God, that act of faith, or uh, I mean, that was right from a heart of faith?
Yeah.
So, was that the only reason?
Actually, I did a study on the good aspect of Simon. That's a good study to do. Look at all the good things that are in Samson's life. Yes, we focus on the weakness, and that overpowered everything else. But look at the good aspect, and you will see that every time, see in the Old Testament also, when the Spirit of God came upon Samson, see, the Spirit of God doesn't come upon us involuntarily, right? It is always voluntary. That means Samson allowed the Spirit of God on those occasions when God wanted to use him. He allowed the Spirit of God to come upon him and to be used by God. That was an act of faith. That was number one. Number two, these are occasions, of course, that he fell. Does it tell us that it was a habit? Does it tell us that it was an addiction? We don't know, right? But it does say that Samson served the Lord, right? And that he ruled the people of Israel at that time. So, and then, of course, finally he came to his senses, and it says that he killed more Philistines with his death than in all his life. So I guess those are, those are good, the good that we can find from his life. One of the things I wanted us to do is that if each of us can take a turn. Last Wednesday when I spoke, 2 Wednesdays back when I was speaking in the assembly, I spoke about life story. And I was saying how we did this in Manipal, and it was a very, very powerful experience. Not just as an experience, but how it deeply encouraged each other. So I want us to take turns. Each one just take 10 minutes. We'll do it by rotation. I'll start next week. Create your own life story on a board or on a PPT, okay, and share it with others. You're welcome to share as much as you feel comfortable sharing. If there are things you're not comfortable sharing, that's perfectly fine. But these are some of the things. For example, like a graph, you can make your graph. You can make your is that the x-axis? You can make your x-axis according to the years of your life, right? Or it may be just experiences of your life. It could be, say, every year, every 5 years, every 10 years, etc., or it could be based on experiences. Consider, as you're making your life story, think about the people who have influenced your life: parents, siblings, uncles, aunts, church elders, etc. Think about the most significant experiences of your life. It could be a health issue. It could be that you shifted. It could be that you moved schools, or you lost someone, a death experience in the family, a separation experience in the family. What are some of the critical moments in your life that influenced you the most? Number 3, think about the high times. The times when you felt really close to God, the times when you really felt you were on a high with God. Number 4, think about the hard times. Times when you fell, times when you were far away from God, or even felt far away from God. Think about questions that you wrestled with in your life. Okay, and this will create a graph of your life, and you can put pictures there. You can put symbols. You can do a life story on faces, smiley faces, or emojis or emoticons, whatever. And you can make that colorful. And what is the purpose of that? Number one is it will help you to reflect on all that has happened in your life. It will fill you with thanksgiving. It will make you realize as you see your life story, how much God has been faithful to you. And you can use that to testify about God. Number two, you can use it as a gospel tool, to see that your story is actually his story. And perhaps you can use those occasions to share the gospel. Number three, so there are other things you can do with that life story. There are points that will help you to determine what helped you to determine meaning and purpose in life. Okay, if you've already come to that point, okay, I've understood what is my purpose. What helped you to do that? Who are the people who helped you to do that? Meaning and purpose. Another thing you can do is put a stone. In the Old Testament, we have memorial stones, right? Jacob and Abraham and all these people, they put memorial stones, Joshua. So put memorial stones where you've had significant moments in your life. And places where your faith has been tested, right? Those are things you can do. So, right, I want to encourage you to do that. I'll start next week, and then, you guys can follow one by one. Just one person every week. Take 10 minutes. We'll take 10 minutes to share your life story. Okay. Next week, Kevin's going to lead the study, and we're looking forward to that. And others also, be prepared. Right, for the month of July, I will call upon you to take the study. Any questions, anything you want to ask, you're welcome to do that. Any prior matter, please do share. Manas, how are you doing? How are things in West Bengal? A lot of drama we can see with the chief minister. We can't hear you, maybe internet connection maybe. Can't hear. That's okay, Manas, don't worry. Yeah. Any prior matter from anyone? Okay.
Yeah, exams over here too. We have exams every Saturday, which they announced on Tuesday. But today there was a program at school, so the exam was yesterday. But now every Saturday we have exams.
Okay. All right, good. Daniel Matthews, can you lead us in prayer?